All right, I think we're all set, folks. Good evening and welcome to this evening's Sagan National Colloquium panel event at Ohio Wesleyan University. My name is Laurie Anderson, and I am a professor of botany and microbiology here at Ohio Wesleyan, and I am co-director of the Sagan National Colloquium along with my colleague, Associate Professor Craig Jackson in the Department of Mathematics and Computer Sciences. I'd like to remind the audience this evening that this panel event will extend until 8:30 to give adequate time for the panelists and the audience to talk and for us to hear the expertise of all of the panelists. I'm going to begin with a short history of the Sagan National Colloquium, and then we'll introduce our panelists. Established in 1984, Ohio Wesleyan University's Sagan National Colloquium annually explores an issue of enduring and powerful social concern from multiple educational angles. The colloquium forges links between liberal arts learning and the lifelong civic art of informed, involved citizenship. In 1999, the colloquium was endowed by 1948 Ohio Wesleyan alumni John and Margaret Sagan, who tirelessly dedicated their expertise and energy to their alma mater throughout their lives, significantly benefiting the university and its students. This year, the theme of the Sagan National Colloquium is interdisciplinary impacts of climate change. And this particular evening, we are very pleased to have a distinguished panel of experts speaking on the interrelated topics of climate ethics, climate justice, and climate activism. When we start to examine the fact that climate change varies in the severity of its impacts across different ethnic, social, political, and economic groups, we start to appreciate that any actions we might take to mitigate climate change must be considered from an ethical perspective. We also recognize that the world has not always pondered the ethical dimensions of its actions in terms of climate change, and so we seek climate justice. Achieving justice requires telling the stories of those most impacted by climate change and taking action to address these wrongs. Our panel has expertise in all of these diverse and interconnected areas. Professor Sherry Stone Mediatore of the Ohio Wesleyan Department of Philosophy will moderate our panel discussion and introduce our panelists.
Thank you all for coming. We have an exceptional group of speaker activists who have cross-disciplinary growth. Sorry, technologically inept here. So thank you all for coming. An exceptional group of speaker activists here who have cross-disciplinary sociology, science, ethics, and community organizing to address the ethical and justice dimensions of climate change. Christiana Peppard is Assistant Professor of Theology, Science, and Ethics at Fordham University. She's the author of the forthcoming book, Just Water, Theology, Ethics, and the Global Water Crisis. She's also the co-editor of the forthcoming volume, Just Sustainability, Technology, Ecology, and Resource Extraction. At Fordham, Christiana teaches such interesting cross-disciplinary courses as theology in science and religion and ecology. And her scholarly articles span topics from environmentalism and Catholic thought to poetry as a component of ethical methodology. Madeline Ostrander is an environmental journalist. She was a senior editor of Yes Magazine from 2007 to 2013, and I encourage all of you to check out Yes Magazine. It has great positive stories of grassroots social change. In 2012, Madeline was the lead editor of 2 issues that earned the Utne Media Award for General Excellence. In 2012, Madeline received an award from the Fund for Investigative Journalism to report on climate change in California. And this past year, she was a visiting scholar with the International Center for Landscape and Language at Edith Cowan University. Sachie Hopkins-Hayakawa is a recent graduate of Swarthmore College, and for the past several years, Sachie has been organizing around fossil fuel divestment with a focus on building student partnerships with communities that have been directly impacted by climate change, such as, for instance, communities in Appalachia that are resisting mountaintop removal. In 2010, Sachie and other members Sachie, and other members of Swarthmore Mountain Justice launched the first fossil fuel divestment campaign in the country. And last February, Sachie helped organize Power Up, a climate justice conference with students from 70 different campuses, including Ohio Wesleyan, so we might have some people here who attended the Power Up conference. So we're going to begin with Christiana.
I'm going to stand up because as a chronic teacher, that's how I'm most comfortable. Now, thank you for the wonderful introduction and for having the three of us here. It's a privilege and a delight to be on a panel with these two excellent women thinkers and actors who are helping us to think better about what it means to be humans and citizens in an era of global climate change. I am a professor, as was noted in the introduction, of theology, science, and ethics at Fordham University. So you might think that I'm here to talk to you about belief or tenets of faith, and I just want to disabuse you of that notion right away. I'm not actually going to talk about questions like, is there a conflict between religious belief and climate change, for reasons that I think other panelists will go into in greater depth. What I'm here to talk about instead is an ethical perspective on why climate change matters, and perhaps give us some tools with which to think about it in an ethical framework. I'll speak, therefore, in three basic movements. One is a little bit about me and how I come to the question of climate change and ethics. The next section will be to talk about how important it is in all of our thinking, especially in the academy, but also beyond, how important it is to think about resituating the human in light of ecological knowledge, in light of the sciences. How is it that we come to understand who we are as humans? And then third, I'll talk a little bit about, given what we know about the world and our actions in it, what are some ways that we can think ethically about the reality at hand? Oh, those are very nice rocks. That's a wonderful introduction. Okay. There. And remember the rocks. They'll come back. I'm an expert on freshwater scarcity and supply and ethics in an era of globalization and climate change. So one of the ways that I come to the question of climate change and ethics is through the medium of water. Everyone comes to the question of climate change, the reality of climate change, rather, from a particular location, from a particular set of skills and knowledge. In my case, that's thinking about how patterns of water use and water availability have been and continue to be impacted by dynamics of climate change on both local and global scales. This photo is, I think, a really nice illustration that indicates how water and climate change are interwoven. It's a photograph of desertification in one of the provinces in China. And it is emblematic in some ways of the fact that water is probably the most important medium through which most of the global population will feel the effects of climate change. So it is that the head of UN Water, a gentleman named Zafar Adil, says climate change is all about water. So it is that Travis Huxman, the scientist who formerly led the Biosphere 2 experiment in Arizona, says water is the hammer with which climate change will hit the Earth. And so it is that we have maxims in various hydrological and climate communities that go something like this. With increasing amplifications of climate patterns, the general rule is that the wet places will get wetter and the dry places will get drier. There are many social, agricultural, economic, and political, and ethical consequences that flow from this, and I write about those in my forthcoming book. But for today, I want to focus especially on climate and humans' place in the world and what kind of actions those intersections might warrant. this is a photograph of part of the world at night. 60, 70, 100, certainly 200, certainly 10,000 years ago, this photograph would have looked very different. How? The illumination, right? These points of light, the electrically powered generation of light in the dark, is a very recent phenomenon in the history of our planet, indeed in the history of the universe. It is a phenomenon powered primarily by the extraction, consumption, combustion of fossil fuels. And the impact that is signified in this image is increasingly referred to by, well, at least academics like myself, some scientists, a number of environmental thinkers, as the Anthropocene. The prefix, anthropos, means basically the human, anthropology, etc. The suffix is the standard denotation of the geological time scale. So the various eras and epochs that constitute deep geological time. The Jurassic period, the Triassic. What lived during those periods? Anyone? Anyone? Dinosaurs. The Cambrian explosion, when life began to proliferate on Earth. Currently, we are in what is formally known as the Holocene. And some atmospheric chemists, some geologists, have indicated that they think we actually should start talking about something called the Anthropocene. Some people say that this era might have started 150, 200, 300 years ago with the scientific and industrial revolutions. Some people say that it might actually have gone back to as many as 10,000 or possibly even 50,000 years ago with the emergence of the first hominid species. But the fact of the matter is that everyone who talks about the Anthropocene is trying to convey a geological insight, and it's this. Humans are increasingly a decisive force on the very Earth systems that have facilitated life. So we are no longer merely an epiphenomenal thing subject to the whims of nature. We are, in fact, changing the world as we inhabit it. And now, granted, when I flew here from LaGuardia on an airplane, I didn't necessarily mean to be changing the climate. I'm not intending, in the clothes I wear, the things I choose to eat or drink, to have negative consequences on economies or environments or other societies worldwide. But the fact of the matter is that we, humanity, the human population in toto, has had a pretty enormous effect on Earth systems. So enormous that some of them may not be self-correcting. So enormous that, in fact, the nature of the Earth is changing. And there are a range of them. If anyone wants to look this up, you can look it up under the category of planetary boundaries. There are about 9 that different scholars talk about. Examples include the 6th extinction that we're currently enacting, which is the extinction of roughly 200 species a day, a massive extinction the likes of which has never been seen on the planet due to one agent species. It also includes massive changes to hydrological systems. And perhaps the most evident, and the one most appropriate for our conversation today, is climate change, right? So with our extraction and combustion of fossil fuels, we are changing the atmospheric composition of the air, the temperature, and all of the systems that are impacted by that particular kind of chemistry. So the Anthropocene. What this does, I think, as a scientific notion, well, on the one hand, it just spurs a lot of debate among geologists. And believe me, given their topic of study, geologists don't always have a lot to debate. It spurs a lot of debate among geologists. It also, I think, as someone who studies ethics, someone who thinks about science, and someone with a PhD in religious studies, it helps us to think about how we as humans interact with the Earth systems that enable life to exist in the first place. As such, it raises a set of questions about ethics. And this then moves to the third kind of topic that I'd like to note in these brief remarks. And that is, what does it mean to be a human being living in the Anthropocene? Do we need to think ethically in ways different from the received ethical traditions of the past? What wisdom can we bring with us from those traditions? And what are some of the new questions that we're facing now in the Anthropocene as a result of globalization and industrialization that probably weren't imagined back when John Stuart Mill was writing his utilitarianism, or folks were writing down various biblical stories, or Kant was walking around the gardens in Königsberg, right? New contexts. History is always providing surprises. And because of those surprises, we have to learn to think well about what it means to be human, and part of thinking well about part of thinking well about what it means to be human also means thinking well about what we do. Now, ethics is really actually not that complicated. It's complex, right? There's a lot of nuance. Good. I'm a scholar. I love detail. But it's actually not that complicated, because what it boils down to is this. How do we understand who we are and what it means to be human? How do we assess the impacts that our lives and our choices, from those little choices of what to eat for dinner to those vast choices of whether to invest in our aging infrastructure, what impacts do those choices have? What kind of data do we take into consideration when thinking about these questions? And what it really, really boils down to is thinking about what's right or wrong, what's good or bad, right? But the thing is, in the Anthropocene, in an era of climate change, thinking about right or wrong, good and bad, those are a little trickier than they have been in the past. Because it's not like I can be Immanuel Kant and enact a prohibition on lying. Well, there are many reasons I'm not Kant, but this is one of them. So he was very fervent that one ought not to lie, because it's a violation of an interpersonal kind of covenant. Fine, be honest, absolutely. But guess what? The kinds of questions presented to us in the Anthropocene are not the same as the kind of individual actions such as lying or truth-telling. They're questions about things like, how do we relate not just to other people, but to the earth and to the resources that are often finite that are sustaining our ways of life? If we, especially in the United States, continue to consume fossil fuels at the rate that we do, we will continue, even if we don't intend to, we will continue to cause amplified temperatures, amplified carbon dioxide concentrations, in ways that have effects far, far, far beyond the neighbors that we can see sitting right in front of us, the neighbors that we can lie to, as Kant would have it. What's unfortunate about climate change, which is largely anthropogenic, which means caused by humans, and which is largely correlated to the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels, as I mentioned. What's unfortunate about that is that the worst effects of global climate change are felt almost always by people who had very little to do with those causes. So folks living in third world countries, folks living in extreme conditions of poverty where sea level rise or the intensification of aridity, desertification, will really, really hinder their ability to subsist at all on the land that they inhabit. And an added tragedy is that for those folks, not only have they by and large not caused the problem, they also are most affected by it, and by virtue of their position in the global economy, are least able to respond effectively to it. That's an ethical problem. It's not that any of us are meaning to make someone's life harder in Bangladesh. It's not that any of us are lying to our direct neighbors, but there is a chain of complex causality. So, ethics is, in a sense, straightforward, but it's also quite complex and indirect in a world that is increasingly shaped by human impacts. This is why, for me, as someone who teaches the topics that I do, thinking about climate change, thinking about religion, thinking about ethics, these are not just questions of received tradition, even though that can be a really helpful guide. They're also questions about epistemology. How do we know what we know? What are we seeing by virtue of these methods of learning? What's being left out? Whose stories are we listening to? And who is being overlooked? Who bears the burdens and may or may not have a seat at the table when the decisions are made in certain political arenas or in the global economy? Now, as a scholar of religion and science and one who's done some work on Catholic social teaching, I do want to say that there are a number of faith traditions that are bringing really important insights to the table. So within the body of work known as Catholic social teaching, for example, there's a deep concern about people living in poverty, who, as mentioned previously, are least able to respond to the challenges posed by global climate change and are generally not responsible for it. And there are some really interesting directions that folks within Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and other religious communities have begun to think about the relationship between humans and the material earth that sustains us, and that in theistic traditions is considered the product of a good God's creation. And those are all really, really promising directions. And those are questions that perhaps some of you in this audience might take up, whether it's from a scholarly perspective or a scientific perspective or a faith community perspective. And I think that's probably what I would like to end with. Is that one of the great paradoxes of living in this era of globalization and environmental degradation is that it is a global phenomenon. And it's mind-bogglingly hard to think globally, right? It's impossible. It's like trying to think about deep geological time and what 500 million or 4 billion years means. It's impossible. It's mind-blowing. So even while we strive to expand our awareness, to attend to the facts, to try to think better, we also have to recognize that we're each rooted in a particular place and a particular way of knowing. And that is great, because it means that we have a place to begin and a place to start from. The challenge then is constantly to explore, to try to think better in order to try to act better. And as such, it's a dynamic, ongoing process of revisability, but it's one of the most important ones that we have as humans. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is on. And I've got a couple slides. Oh. Is this the slide? No, it's a different.
No, that was the last one.
So, down at the bottom. Oh, sorry, I'm creating feedback. Yeah. So, can we go? How do we show it? Where?
This one. That little here.
Cool. Okay. And is this one?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry, technological issues. Okay. Well, so am I double mic'd? Okay. So I wanted to talk a bit about stories, as you all heard a bit ago. I'm a journalist, and so I'm really fascinated by stories and the way that they influence us. And ethics are a lot about the choices that we make, and those choices are heavily influenced by the stories that we tell. And so I want to talk about the stories that we tell about climate change. This is an image of your brain on stories. It's based on some research that was done by brain scientists. When we hear abstract words, they activate this tiny little part of the brain called the Brocas area and the Wernicke's area. And so they don't engage our brain in as full of a way as when we hear very descriptive sensory language. So they did this study where if you said to people, he had leathery hands, or you said to people, Pablo kicked the ball, the same areas in the brain that would light up if you were actually touching somebody's leathery hands, or if you were kicking a ball, lit up when people heard those words. And so part of what this means is that stories are kind of the mental maps that tell us how to move, that help us choreograph the ways that we live in the world and think about them and sort of rehearse what we're going to do. And so, so there's a reason why stories are so important to culture. They help us engage with the situations that we have to encounter in life. There we go. Okay. So for many years now, scientists have been telling us something fairly consistent about climate change. 97% of scientists, roughly speaking, say that humans are causing global warming. And this was a report that somebody did for a website called the Smog Blog, which focuses on climate change. He reviewed about 14,000 peer-reviewed climate articles spanning 20 years, and out of all of those, 24 rejected global warming. So the consensus has been really very strong for quite a number of years. But unfortunately, there's a story that a lot of us have heard repeated in the news media. And I want to say that, although there has been lots of fantastic reporting all across the country by a lot of really great reporters on climate change and how we think about it, there was also this story that keeps coming up that presents a problem known as false equivalence. And it's where a minority source or a minority opinion is given a bit more space than actually that minority opinion represents in the world, in reality. So this small percentage of scientists, and some of them aren't actually scientists. I mean, some of the sources that you see quoted who are saying climate change isn't happening are actually not people who are trained in science. But that small minority view gets more representation or disproportionate amount of representation compared to the amount of controversy that exists really in the scientific community. And so the story that we keep talking about and that we've sort of gotten stuck in is the story of controversy. Is climate change real? Is it not real? Do we agree? Do we not agree? Should we act? Should we not act? Meanwhile, the picture scientists have been giving us has actually gotten stronger and more urgent. And I think that's something that a lot of the public doesn't entirely know. The problems of climate change are arriving more quickly, and they're even more dire than scientists initially expected when they first started talking about this. Partly because they assumed that the world would actually do something about it sooner than we have. Between 2000 and 2010, carbon emissions grew faster than the worst case scenario scientists predicted back in the 1990s. And we are already starting to see weather patterns and other problems that are influenced by climate change. For instance, Hurricane Sandy, which many scientists agree was made worse by climate change, more severe wildfires that are happening in the West, and drought, recurring drought in places like the Southwest United States. And so we're now no longer talking about whether we can stop climate change altogether. We're talking about whether we can keep it from getting so out of hand that things are pretty unpleasant. and that many of our communities can't really adapt and are dealing with a state of crisis or emergency. At the same time, media coverage of climate change has declined precipitously since a high point around 2006, 2007, just after Hurricane Katrina and after Inconvenient Truth. And so we're not even really hearing stories about climate change and what we should do about it. And I guess the other thing I would say about this story is climate change real? Isn't it real? Should we do something? Shouldn't we? Is that it's not really a very good story. When you think about that picture of the brain that I showed you just a moment ago, it doesn't do any of those things. It doesn't give us any mental maps about what we need to do. It doesn't help us make decisions. It doesn't, it's not a very good story. So, you know, the story we should be talking about is what do we do now that we know climate change is happening? Let's stop talking about whether it's happening or not. We need to make a lot of practical, ethical, pragmatic choices, economic choices in our communities, in our country about what do we do now. And those are questions we have to begin addressing urgently because they're enormous questions in a lot of ways. And so I think we need to be beginning to tell stories about what does this mean for us. And we need to beginning dialogue with scientists and policymakers about what does this mean for us. And so I wanted to tell you, since I am by trade a storyteller, a couple of stories about people who began thinking about this. And these are stories that come from my own reporting. Okay, so this is a photo of a man named Randy Thompson. Randy is a rancher in Nebraska, and he owns about 400 acres of farmland that he inherited from his parents. And about 5 years ago, Randy got a call from a Canadian company called TransCanada asking to run an oil pipeline through his property. And at first he said, yeah, okay, I'll give you permission to come on my land. And then he changed his mind. He runs cattle on an area where the water table is really shallow. He said, we got to thinking they're going to bury a pipeline 4 feet deep in our land, and if it leaks, it's going to leak right into our water supply. The water supply is part of the Ogallala Aquifer, which is the water source for 8 states. And through parts of Nebraska, including Randy's land and in the Sandhills, the aquifer is very shallow. So you've probably heard about this pipeline. It's called Keystone XL. And you may have heard a couple of stories about it. And one story is that it's really important to the Canadian economy and to the oil industry, and that it may create some number of jobs in the United States, although what number of jobs is rather hotly contested. Another story is that it would have a very serious impact on climate change. If it's built, it will carry a sticky, viscous form of crude oil called tar sands oil, or also called technically diluted bitumen, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. Diluted bitumen is a mix of oil and solvents, including things like benzene, which is a carcinogen. It's got the consistency of peanut butter, and so it's kind of hard to clean up when it spills into your water supply. And if the pipeline is built, it will most likely lead to significant increases in extraction in the tar sands, which will lead to some significant increases in carbon dioxide emissions, which is the main contributor to climate change. And when this project was first proposed, most policymakers assumed that it was going to get pretty quick approval because TransCanada has had a close relationship with some people who also work in the Obama administration. And, I think it was not assumed to be a controversial project. People like Randy heard from TransCanada that if they didn't sign an agreement with them, that the company was going to use eminent domain to cross their property, which made a lot of ranchers in Nebraska really angry. And Randy started writing letters to the editor, which he'd never done before, and he began attending protests, which he'd also never done before. And he was a lifelong Republican, but he started consorting with the Democrats and environmentalists and people that he'd never normally spoke with. I interviewed him one day in his home a couple of years ago in Nebraska. And the whole process of getting involved in these questions of what kind of future does Nebraska want? Does it want to be part of this big fossil fuel economy? Does it want to have a pipeline running through its water sources? What is valuable to Nebraskans? Has caused him to re-examine his positions on a lot of questions, including climate change. And so I asked him what he thought about it. And he said, well, originally, I kind of thought it was a bunch of BS. But the more I became involved in this whole thing and I saw what's going on, it's raised my awareness. And I asked him why his opinions changed, and he said, you get busy trying to raise a family or trying to make a living. I was just kind of keeping my nose to the grindstone. I just kept working. I didn't really think too much about it. And then all this came along, and I started seeing some of the environmental problems that could be involved. I should also note that Nebraska could be threatened by things like drought because of climate change, and that could also have an impact on people like Randy as they try to feed their cattle. So climate change puts Nebraska at risk for a lot of reasons. And the story of this pipeline, as many of you know, has become a hugely important story to the environmental movement because it is such a tangible example of the choices that we face as communities, as a nation, about what kind of economy do we want to have, and how does that reflect on particular people? How does it impact them in their lives? And I also tell this story because it's an example of where many of us are. We're busy with our noses to the grindstone in our own lives, and we hear some things about climate change or about fossil fuels, but we often aren't engaged in conversations about the big questions that we face. And so one of the things that this particular campaign has done has start a question nationally about this pipeline. What does it mean? Do we need it or don't we need it? How will it affect us? What does it mean about climate change? And that's been really interesting to watch, and it's a new kind of story than what we've been talking about in the past about climate change. So I'm having a hard time. How? No. How? I know I have your watch, but we need to finish up at 8. Is that right? Are we? With the 8:30, but with. Right. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So this is another story. This is a family in Los Angeles that I interviewed for a story in The Nation magazine. And the woman on the left, whose name is Maria, is the mother of the man on the right, whose name is Ruben. And the woman in the middle, named Melissa, is his girlfriend. All three of them have lived in a neighborhood next to the port of Los Angeles, where there are 5 oil refineries located within a few miles of each other, owned by big companies like ConocoPhillips and Tesoro. The risk of cancer in the neighborhood they live is 20% higher than the average for the south coast of California, and that's because of all the pollution that's in the air. And things like diesel emissions as well. Melissa's mother has stage 4 cancer. She and her mother have lived in this community their entire lives. Maria, the woman on the left, has a daughter and grandchildren who have asthma, and the rates of asthma in this community are also much higher here than they are in some other parts of Southern California. Also, again, because of the air pollution. So the family is already feeling more of the impact of our petroleum-based economy than many of us do. And they may end up feeling the impacts of climate change earlier than some other communities in Los Angeles. Their neighborhood is also flat and low-lying, and parts of it are below sea level, which means that as sea level rises, because of climate change, this family is in one of a couple of areas that will be most at risk. And Los Angeles right now is doing a number of really detailed, very interesting studies about how climate change, neighborhood by neighborhood, will affect the city and the county. The second neighborhood that is most vulnerable in Los Angeles to sea level rise will be Venice Beach, which is where a lot of wealthy people and celebrities live and where beat poets hung out in the 60s. And so the questions Los Angeles has to deal with and has begun to ask is, when climate change hits us, how do we protect families like this, who are very vulnerable? How do we protect our iconic neighborhoods like Venice Beach? How do we think about what kind of place Los Angeles will be? Is it a place that people can comfortably live in 40 years? And if so, how do we make decisions that make it that way? And some of the studies also are showing differences in how globally the amount of carbon emissions we have is going to impact Los Angeles locally. So the impacts on the city become much more dire the less we do internationally to rein in carbon dioxide emissions. But either way, Los Angeles has to ask itself some tough questions about how do we pay for this stuff, and who do we help first, and how do we deal with issues of fairness and vulnerability. There are also questions about how much California wants to continue having an economy that relies on big industries like refineries that are contributing to the state's poor air quality. California is one of the few states that has major regulations on greenhouse gas emissions, so we may see the California economy start to shift. Although, on the other hand, refineries are associated with a huge amount of infrastructure and are still very important to our economy. So, there are a lot of questions to be asked there. And so I offered these as just a couple of examples of the kinds of stories that we need to be telling about climate change and the kinds of tangible conversations we need to be having. And I think you'll start seeing at least some more of these stories in the news media. The Society for Environmental Journalists just published a special report that says stories about adapting to climate change are the big new beat. This is the story that we need to be talking about, that we need to be telling, that we need to be reckoning with, especially as we start to see more weather patterns influenced by climate change. But I also think that all of you here, these are stories and conversations that everyone can begin having in their own communities. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of decisions to be made. The decisions we make about climate change will touch every aspect of our lives and the things that we hold dear. And according to the Yale Project on Climate Communications, Americans are most likely to identify their own friends and family, such as a significant other, son, daughter, or close friend, as the people who could motivate them to take action to reduce global warming. So the conversations that we all have with one another are really important, even though they're not always easy to have. They're really important to motivating action. So that's kind of it for me.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Hi, everyone. I'm going to stand over here because my notes are on this computer. So my name is Sachie. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, but I now live in Philadelphia. And I graduated in June from Swarthmore College, which is right outside of Philadelphia. And for the last couple of years, I've been involved in student organizing around climate and environmental justice issues. So my hope is that if I share with all of you some of my experiences, questions, challenges, decisions, all of those things, that you'll be able to kind of pick out some useful pieces and apply them to some of the questions and projects that you're working on. Yeah. So in 2010, a group of Swarthmore students went to West Virginia to meet some of the communities that were organizing against mountaintop removal coal mining. Are people in the room familiar with mountaintop removal? Have you all heard of it? Okay, so just a brief overview. It's a form of coal mining that, rather than digging down into the earth like traditional coal mining, the coal companies use explosives to blow up the top of the mountain so that the coal seam is left exposed, and then heavy machinery just digs out the coal in huge quantities. And it's a devastating practice to the region for a number of different reasons. All of that fill that was the top of the mountain is poured into streams. So I think like 2,000 miles of streams have been filled. It's boulders have landed on people's homes from the explosives, and cancer rates in the area have doubled since mountaintop removal has started, and birth defects are on the rise. It's just every kind of impact, and it's already an economically struggling region. So now people are having more healthcare costs and having to move and all these other sorts of expenses. So one of the activists that we met while we were down there was a man by the name of Larry Gibson, whose family had owned a small piece of property, one hill mountain called Peppard Mountain, and it had been within his family for a number of generations. And all around Peppard Mountain, the coal industry had basically blown up all the mountains surrounding his property, but Larry was insistent that he was not going to sell his land. And for that, he received a lot of pushback from other folks in the region who are dependent on the coal industry for their livelihood. And so, you know, people had shot at his home. They killed his dog. And a number of like really just awful things. It's an incredibly divisive issue in the region. So Larry took us around his property. He talked to us about his work and what he had been doing. And when we were done, at the end of that, he looked at us and he said, "I've shared all of this with you. If you go home and don't do anything about this, then I've wasted my time." And we took that really seriously. And it was really hard to hear because normally it's sort of like, go get them, kind of like excited, rah, rah. And this was like, I wasted my time if you don't act on this. So we went back to Swarthmore and really thought critically about how we could make our actions on campus impactful and meaningful to communities that were not in the same area or region. And, you know, we were facing a number of challenges. We felt like legislation on the national level was not working. We felt like we were at a distance and didn't know how to do, we couldn't be driving back and forth to West Virginia to be doing kind of direct aid work. And we felt like the sort of consumer activism, lifestyle activism methods weren't working either. So we were doing a lot of sustainability things on campus, but we also knew that nobody in West Virginia was trying to end mountaintop removal simply by changing their light bulbs. That was important, but it needed to be scaled up. And so we started thinking about what is the role of educational institutions in the climate fight. Educational institutions are the homes for young people most often, and they should be at the forefront of the climate fight. They should be protecting our generation. So we did a lot of research and discovered that a common tactic that had been used in the late 80s and 90s was divestment, so particularly around South African apartheid. So students in the US who cared about apartheid were trying to figure out how best they could support this battle, and so they called on their board of regents, trustees, managers, whatever you want to call it, to pull their investments out of companies who are doing business in apartheid South Africa. So we said, let's do that with fossil fuels. We're going to stop supporting the companies who are doing this to these communities. So at that time, nobody else was doing fossil fuel divestment. We didn't know where our investments were because there was no transparency around that. We didn't understand how an endowment works. And so we spent a long time just doing research. And at that, we also knew that moving our small amount of money that was in the fossil fuel industry was not going to cripple the largest industry in the world, basically. So it was more coming from a place of kind of political symbolism. We don't condone the practices of these industries, and we won't be participants, and we're not going to bet on the success of these industries anymore. The cool thing about organizing is that if you start with an idea that seems idealistic and you build power around it, it can slowly be pulled into the realm of what's politically realistic. So when we started, there were a few other schools that were doing coal divestment, but nobody was doing fossil fuel divestment. And we started talking to different organizations, talking to different campuses, saying, hey, we think this is a cool idea. Do you think that other people would be on board with this? And then last, let's see here, October or so, about a year ago, an organization called 350.org launched the Do the Math Tour, where they traveled from city to city explaining why fossil fuel divestment was an important step in the climate fight. And all of a sudden, campuses all over the country, cities all over the country were engaging in divestment and saying, we also will not be complicit in these practices. At that time, we also thought, okay, a lot of students are brand new to organizing, we're brand new to organizing, we need to get together and we need to share our ideas and our stories and our questions and our challenges. And we need to connect with the communities who've been waging this battle for decades. So while the climate movement might be relatively young, there's a number of communities who've been fighting the fossil fuel industry for decades, including folks in Appalachia, including the communities next to refineries. And they're experts in this battle. So we put together a national convergence with campuses from 70 different, or students from 70 different campuses came to Swarthmore last February, and the conference was entirely designed by students, put on by students, organized by students. We had a lot of organizational partners who helped support us, but it was student-led, which was really exciting. And the other important part was we brought a number of frontline activists to come share their stories with us and tell us what does it mean to fight Arch Coal or Chevron? What is that struggle like? And here's what, and to present to us what they had learned in that struggle. And in that way, we really started to kind of tighten the bonds between young people and frontline communities who are two of the most important stakeholders in climate justice and climate stability. Maybe now's a good time to show that video. So this is a video put together that just kind of highlights some of the things that happened that weekend, and it's put together by my good friend, Zane. Maybe refresh it. So that's just a little bit of a glimpse into some of the organizing work that I was a part of with a number of other amazing students. And so I think I'm doing okay on time. I wanted to just kind of share a few lessons I've learned over the last couple years, and I'll try and just keep them brief. So one of the first things that I've learned is that everyone is an expert on their own experience. So historically, we tend to have pretty narrow definitions of what expertise looks like and what knowledge looks like. I think both of these, the other panelists also spoke to that. However, like I said, some of these communities have been waging this struggle for decades, which means they are experts in that experience. So the folks in Appalachia are experts on Arch Coal and the EPA and the Clean Water Act. Communities in Richmond, California, where a fire at a refinery sent 15,000 people to the hospital last year, they're experts on Chevron. And so sometimes it's easy to think that only the most credentialed people in the room or the people in DC with the nice desk are the experts, but history has shown us that struggles for justice have rarely been led by the most credentialed people in the room. So that's one thing. Whatever projects we take on, whatever commitments we make within the climate movement, we can't solely transition from one type of fuel to another. There also has to be a serious redistribution of power. So from an environmental justice, economic justice, climate justice framework, let's say ExxonMobil starts mass producing solar panels tomorrow, but they're still exploiting workers, exporting jobs, and using dangerous mining practices for those metals. That's not environmental justice either, and that's not going to move us forward in the ways that we need it to. If you're going to try to deconstruct something, you also need to know what you're going to build in its place. So Andy Cornell uses the phrase, if you're going to oppose something, you must simultaneously be proposing. And I think that that's pretty exciting work because it allows us to imagine what alternative economies, what alternative forms of community, what alternative energy and food and water systems could look like. And these can be systems that are, more democratically owned and are placed within the communities that they actually service. And so if you're constantly just doing resistance work and fighting from a place of longing and not a place of love for something you've created, then you're not going to have the same sustainability to your work than if you are fighting from this place of commitment to something that you're also creating. So I think that opens up an opportunity to plug community reinvestment projects, which I'm hoping will be the next big wave after divestment, is how can we roll over these funds into community-owned projects that provide jobs, that support renewable energy, and it's not just moving our money from one mega corporation to another. And I was telling Craig that it might not seem like a lot of money if you take your investment out of ExxonMobil, they might not blink. But if you take that same $1 million and put it into a community sourced project, it can completely transform that community. And that's really exciting to think about. And then the last thing I would just say is connect the young people's climate movement sits at a really exciting intersection with other movements led by students, such as DREAM activists who are fighting for undocumented students' rights, or student debt. All these different struggles, they're actually really intertwined. And sometimes it's easy to get tunnel vision because of the climate science and the numbers and think that, okay, there's so much urgency here, I need to just be working on climate change. But actually, the same communities that are usually seen as sacrificial, whether it's for a toxic facility or deportation or prison or immense debt, those communities all have intertwined struggles, and they need to be working together and draw strength from each other's struggles instead of become siloed within the work that they're doing in that moment. And then the last thing I've learned is that a movement needs everybody. If a movement was only for people of a precise identity, a precise politic, a precise skill set, then it wouldn't be a movement. So if you just take time to really think about, okay, what are the skills I bring? What are the experiences I bring? What are the different forms of knowledge I bring? Whether they're from the classroom or not from the classroom, that's gonna start providing you different opportunities to build engagement and discover your strengths in the work that you're doing. And that also means invite lots of different people to do that work with you. So I would just leave you with a question about coming from there. How do you as a student, a community of students, have the most power to affect change? And how can you organize with each other so that that change is all that much more impactful? That's all, thank you.
And questions so everyone can hear. We'll do Paul, and then I'll go to this gentleman.
Thanks. My question's for Sachie. Can you just talk about a little bit more about your experience at Swarthmore in terms of the divestment process there? Like, you mentioned that, Board of Trustees, their favorite thing is not exactly to be totally transparent about their endowments and how they make those decisions. So how did you guys, who are totally new to this process, learn about it and go about working with them?
So I guess the first thing that's important to say is that we haven't divested yet. But I think that, like I said, the most powerful part of divestment as a tactic is that it starts to get people to question what is the purpose of an endowment and an educational institution in this fight. And so you don't have to actually have divestment to get that question planted. I was talking to someone, I guess it was last semester, a speaker who came to campus, and I said, I'm really frustrated. We've had 25 meetings, we've held actions, we've done a petition, we've done banner drops, we've done everything in the book. We've done our homework on social movement theory, and we're not winning yet. And he was basically like, if you launched this campaign and you won it a month later, then you wouldn't have hosted this conference. You wouldn't have visited all these other campuses. It would not have nearly had the impact that it's had. So I think that was a really important thing to remember, that it's, yes, the campaign is to get that money moved, but really the whole process along the way, that journey is just as important, if not more. And so in that way, it's okay that we haven't won yet, because we're creating these political ripples all along the way.
My question is primarily for Christiana Peppard, although for others as well. I believe very strongly ethics is very central to this whole issue. I wouldn't be here otherwise. But ethics can be talked about in academic, theoretical, oughtness, should do this, should do that. But unless and until you see it in its political context, it misses the whole game. Let me give you an example. How would you allocate the water going through the Jordan Valley, and where Palestine and Israel are concerned? Who controls that water, and how could it be allocated? Now, you can't get into that whole issue about Palestine and Israel, but water is very critical to what's going on there. How should that be allocated?
Thank you. That's a great question. And since I don't know you, I know that you're not a plant that I sent to ask that question. In my book, one of the chapters is on the Jordan River, and I published an article earlier this spring in the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences that talks about the Jordan River as a politically contested entity, as an economic source of livelihood for many communities and nation states on various parts of the river, and that also talks about the Jordan River as an environmentally degraded river very hydrologically diverted as well, that nonetheless retains a very powerful symbolic stature in the religious and political imaginaries and ideologies of various traditions. I agree with you, absolutely, that in the present day, knowing and thinking about shouldness or oughtness, as you said, is one thing. But it's not really ethics until it hits the ground and starts walking. I absolutely agree with you. And I also agree that the political realm, especially questions about economics and investment, as Sachie has so eloquently presented, are one realm where we need both to think and act ethically. For some folks that, well, let me back up a little bit and say that I don't think there is any one-size-fits-all solution or best approach to solving X problem. Whether that problem is climate change, whether that problem is corporate governance that privileges shareholders above stakeholders, whether that problem is water distribution, privatization, and access. But there are better and worse ways, and we only learn about what ways are better and worse, in what kind of contexts, with what kind of specific aspects and facets and details, when we hear the kinds of stories that Madeline is talking about, and when we try and fail, or try and kind of succeed, or try and trip, or maybe we try and we succeed robustly the first time, but that's rare. So I agree with you that it can be very tempting to sit in an ivory tower and think, well, this is the ethical thing to do, and of course we should respect the earth, and doesn't everyone want to support other communities? But the question then is how you change knowing into doing, right? Because that's ethics, how we know what we know, and then how we choose to act knowing what we know. I think one of the biggest challenges in a global era is that individual action, the changing the light bulbs that Sachie referenced, makes a difference. And it's really important for cultivating virtuous habits and patterns of awareness. But it's not enough. Because the scale of things is so big, because the dynamics of an economy that is oriented towards infinite growth on a finite planet are much more endemic to global structures politically and economically than is the individual act of changing light bulbs. And that's why this question of scaling up and mutual community support is really important and also really interesting in a digital era with all of the kinds of technologies that are enabling communities to learn from one another and connect in ways that never previously had happened.
Yes, the panel has been talking about humans and human communities, but we are currently using 1.5 times Earth's productivity every year, and we, believe it or not, depend on other organisms for our very survival. And those other organisms are at risk from our actions. Do we owe, in right sharing, other organisms as well as ourselves the ability to live in a world that can support them?
You know, it's interesting. I was just reading on the plane on the way over a really great book and web resource that I highly recommend, edited by Kathleen Dean Moore, called Moral Ground, Resources for a Planet in Peril, I believe. One of the entries is by Dave Foreman, who some of you may know as the founder of Earth First. And Foreman was asked in his essay to respond to that exact question. And he said, fine, I'll respond to it, but let me tell you, I think it's actually the wrong question. Okay, why? Well, he says, because that's a very human-centered question. The question really should be, what right do we have to go trampling? And so there are lots of debates in environmental ethics about whether an environmental ethic that holds human well-being at its center, that is primarily concerned about the suffering of vulnerable populations, as I talked about, whether that's sufficient. don't we need an ethic of flourishing for the many kinds of species and ecosystems that constitute the world? And these are important debates. My take on it in some ways, in the simplest terms, is that we're human and we're pretty self-centered. And so we have to start there because it's kind of the gateway drug. You know, thinking about ourselves, telling stories about ourselves, it's like, sure, you know, having a hard time at a party, just ask someone about themselves and they'll start talking. Not really. But then we can expand the circle of moral considerability. And so it is, I take your question with total seriousness, and I think you're right. And there are lots and lots of conversations about how these things ought to proceed in environmental ethics. But it's part of why thinking about where we humans fit as a species on the planet, granted a wonderful, highly consequential, very cognizant, capable of lying kind of species, is really important, you know, because we're part of things. We're not apart from them. Do you guys want to add anything from your perspectives?
I mean, I think you pretty well summed it up, but I guess the only other, I mean, I think to some extent it's hard to get beyond the frame of reference of ourselves, and to me, the question about, to some extent about other organisms, it comes back to a question of what kind of world do we want to live in. So, and interestingly, when you ask people that question, I mean, a lot of people sort of have very similar answers, that they actually do care about nature on, you know, some level or another, that they want to live in a clean, healthy, beautiful place, that they want their kids to be healthy, that, you know, I mean, most people have actually more similar values than you would think. And so, you know, I think, I don't know, I mean, sometimes I'm concerned that the environmental movement has spent a little bit too much time talking about charismatic species and trying to get people to identify with those, and that climate change becomes a question about altruism when it's actually a question both about self-preservation and preservation of all of the things that matter to us. And among the things that matter to us may be, you know, a lot of other species that we share the planet with, those other species, those that being part of this global ecosystem or this local ecosystem may be part of what's really important to us, part of what informs our sense of place, what it means to be human, how we find meaning and enjoyment, how we survive, because we need all of those other species to, you know, make the ecosystems we live in work. But I think it's pretty hard to get away from the human frame of reference. But I don't think that the human frame of reference has to necessarily be at the expense of other species. I think that actually what should be good for us in the long run and should be sustainable should also be better for the species that we share this space with. So, do you have anything to add? Okay.
When I graduated from high school 50 years ago, this year, there were about 3.5 billion people in the world, 3 billion to 3.5 billion. Now we're well north of 7 billion. And we will have 10 billion sometime in the next 20 or 30 years, and then so it goes, with the population doubling every couple or three decades for the rest of this century. I haven't heard any of you speak about population as having a serious impact on climate change, but I do think that it may well be the one thing that, well, if there's a root to this evil of climate change, perhaps it is population expansion and population growth. Would you care to comment about that, anyone?
I love this question. Malthus's principle of population growth, 1798, was, along with the then burgeoning science of geology, one of the 2 or 3 major factors that enabled Darwin to postulate his theory of descent with modification by natural selection in The Origin of Species in 1859. In 1859, the first oil well, productive oil well, started functioning in Pennsylvania. In 1859, the first photograph of Yosemite Valley was taken. Since that time, global population has grown dramatically, subject not so much to the famines and acute disease plagues that had controlled human population up until this time, but rather population growth happened because of the development of germ theory, of epidemiology, of sanitation and infrastructure systems, because of fossil fuel extraction and the ways in which industrialization improved quality of life on the whole, not in every case. And it is very much the case that the application of petrochemical-based fertilizers, widespread extraction of groundwater, and the application of particular kinds of plant species to formerly arid areas during the Green Revolution have enabled a type of population growth that is unprecedented in the history of the world. It is a huge, huge factor in every form of environmental degradation and many forms of social struggle that we see today. So yes, I agree with you. I think it is also one of the most difficult topics to discuss for a number of reasons. Number one, it's dangerous as folks who sit atop the pyramid of global privilege to say that those people reproducing at a rapid rate in other parts of the world need to corral their birth rates. While we continue to consume a disproportionate share of the Earth's resources. It's dangerous because it can allow us to foist the problem onto other people. Are there population pressures? Absolutely. Are there population problems? Absolutely. Will the planet's finite land and water resources be able to feed the world in the 21st century? I hope so, but I don't know. And is it the case that when women are able to get an education and have some kind of economic self-determination, that they choose to have fewer children? Absolutely. Is it possible to stand in solidarity with folks who seek those kinds of developments? Absolutely. Does that mean that, therefore, in response to environmental issues, the globally powerful we ought to say that the solution is to stop population growth? Not necessarily. And I think this gets to the point of, well, on the one hand, how would that even look? What would we even do about that? On the other hand, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. There are many, many, many causes, and there are many, many, many kinds of interventions that can be made. But I tend to be very skeptical of people or societies that are in power foisting imperatives upon folks who have neither chosen those types of strictures nor contributed to the causes of the problem to which developed societies are now trying or failing, or not trying at all, to respond. So I think it's a really thorny issue that is hard to think about well, and people are starting to do it. There's been a couple things in Orion magazine recently about it, but it's, was Paul and Anne Ehrlich in 1968 right with the population bomb? In a sense, sure, but in another sense, it hasn't quite detonated, but it might. And So we need all the good thinking that we can get on the topic, but we need to be careful of the kinds of blind spots that come about when we, in positions of power and privilege, start talking about what other people should do to make the world more habitable.
I just wanted to make a short comment in defense of light bulbs. First of all, there are a great many things that can be done in the very mundane areas of buildings, yards, planting trees, and other kinds of things like that. And probably on this campus, and certainly in many campuses across the country, there is a person in a very mundane office known as physical facilities, and that person may very well be an expert on many of those kinds of things that can be done to increase energy use, or I mean not to increase energy use, but to increase energy efficiency and other kinds of things that can be done on campuses. And this is across the country, these people. So if you would go to talk to the director of physical facilities or the vice chancellor in charge of facilities, you might find out that that person knows a great deal about what can be done on campus to make people more aware, to make the campus more effective environmentally. The second thing I'd like to say, which is sort of a come down maybe, and that is that a number of years ago, I heard a wonderful lecture by a man named Edward Masria, who is an architect, and the organization is called Architecture 2030. That's T2030. Architecture. Oh, okay. All I wanted to say is I would encourage anyone here to look at his website, because he has done a study of what would happen in many global in many coastal cities if the sea levels rise 1 meter. How many streets will be taken out of places like New York City or Boston or other coastal cities around the country? And it's a really important work that he's done. So it's Architecture 2030.
Pressure. So with all the experiences and the people that y'all have worked with, where do you see in the future change in the culture of America coming from? Like, where do you see that shift really coming? Because I feel like right now there's like the people in this room and the people that are invested in this topic are really invested, but there's so many people in America and so many different views that are really hard to get around. And so how do you see people coming together to change the culture around these issues?
All right, I'll take a stab at that one. So I guess one thing I can say is that I spend a lot of time, or I have spent a fair bit of time, interviewing people in fairly conservative parts of the country, including a lot of farmers. I've ended up talking to a lot of farmers. And one thing that I noticed, but not, of course a lot among farmers, but also among people in general, is a lot of passion for the places where people live. A lot of passion for the landscape they live in, the things that make that place meaningful, the things that make it beautiful, the ecology of that place, the water resources, the rivers that flow through it. And that kind of concern crosses political boundaries. And when you get down to the local level, people aren't nearly as divided on those kinds of issues. They really value very similar things about the place they live in. And I think, and I mean, this is part of what I was trying to allude to in my talk, but I think, to me, part of what I believe might get people to change their ways of thinking about and dealing with and making decisions about climate change is to understand that this is a set of questions that affect every place that we live in. And everything that we value about that place is in jeopardy because of climate change. And so we need to start thinking about, A, how do we adapt to climate change, but B, how do we mobilize and act as a society to make the kinds of decisions that will prevent this from becoming such a huge problem that these places that we love, can't survive anymore. So that's what I see. Does anyone?
That sounds very good. I believe we have reached the end of our time, and let's thank our excellent panel.